Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker and to welcome you to the first of two Tanner Lectures on Human Values given this year by Nicholas Lemon, Professor of Journalism and Dean Emeritus at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. His topic is The Transaction Society, Origins and Consequences. We've been delighted to offer the Tanner Lectures here at Stanford for many years. Professor Obert Clark Tanner was an industrialist and legal scholar who studied philosophy at Harvard and Stanford, and later served as a member of the Stanford Faculty in Religious Studies. He was also quite a progressive when it came to employment opportunities, particularly for women in his company, far ahead of his time, which was established in Utah, of all places. So, in establishing the lecture series in 1978, Professor Tanner said he hoped they would, and I quote, provide a better understanding of human behavior and human values. In fact, he was also a great fan of fountains and is responsible for the fountain in front of Memorial Auditorium. When the fountain was gifted, there were a group of people at Stanford who said, "But we don't want a fountain, we want something else." And Obert said, "But I'm giving fountains." So we have a fountain. Today's lecturer has certainly helped us understand human behavior and human values. But before introducing him, I want to say a special thank you and recognize the people who organized this year's lecture. Please join me in thanking the members of the Bowen McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society, the Tanner's Lecture Steering Committee, and our staff that put this together. Thank you to all of you. Nicholas Lemon is a distinguished journalist who has written widely for such publications as The New Yorker, The New York Times, The New Republic, and Slate. He is also on the faculty of the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, where he recently stepped down as dean after serving for 10 years. He became dean at an important turning point for the school. Columbia's president, Lee Bollinger, had charged a national task force with re-examining the school's mission. Certainly the last few decades have been a time of change and challenge for journalism and journalism programs. And Dean Lemon has described his tenure as, and I quote, "a great and unexpected adventure." Certainly it was a great period for the school. Under his leadership, a number of significant initiatives were launched, including a new Master of Arts journalism degree, Columbia's first additional journalism program in 75 years, which complements the Master of Science program. The school completed its first capital fundraising campaign, exceeding its goals. 20 new colleagues were added to the faculty, a new student center was built, and quite critically, new programs in investigative reporting, digital journalism, and executive leadership for news organizations were introduced. And then finally, in a collaboration with Stanford's Engineering School, the David and Helen Gurley Brown Institute for Media Innovation was established. When Professor Lemon decided to step down as dean, there was an uproar. But as he explained, my best ideas have been implemented. It's time for somebody else to take over. He continued, "I want to go back to what I was doing before, which is to choose a big socio-political event in American history and tell the story of that event." Nicholas Lemon knew at a very early age that he wanted to be a journalist. But through his parents' influence, he also developed a strong appreciation for the academy. He was born and raised in New Orleans. His parents were not academics, but as he explained to the class of 2013 in his final commencement speech, they had, quote, "a reverential attitude towards universities. In our house, colleges and universities were magical places where life revolved around books and learning." Happily, they still are such magical places. He started his career in journalism early. As a senior in high school, he pitched the idea of writing articles for an alternative weekly in New Orleans. They agreed. If he agreed to distribute the newly published papers, put them in coin boxes, and collect payments from the boxes. After graduating from Harvard in history and literature, he held various positions as journalist and editor of the Washington Monthly, the Washington Post, the Atlantic Monthly, and the New Yorker. Over the course of his career, he's written numerous and wide-ranging articles on subjects ranging from politics to education, race relations to internet journalism. In addition to his many articles, Professor Lemon is the author of 5 books, including Redemption, The Last Battle of the Civil War, which focuses on the Reconstruction era in Mississippi in the early 1870s. He shows how the unfinished agenda and failure of Reconstruction affects this country and race relations more than 100 years later. In The Big Test, The Secret History of the American Meritocracy, Lemon tackles the creation of the SAT and attempts to reform and restore its importance and its equality. His award-winning book, The Promised Land, The Great Black Migration and How It Changed America, was a New York Times bestseller. David Brian Davis, a former Tanner lecturer here at Stanford, called it, and I quote, "a compelling, powerful book that should be read by anyone interested in the continuing history of racial oppression and conflict in the United States." So it is particularly fitting that Nicholas Lemon is this year's Tanner Lecturer. He values both journalism and the academy and believes that they can inform and strengthen each other. As he explained in last year's commencement remarks, journalists, quote, "are storytellers, trained to work quickly and to present the results of our reporting in a way that they will capture and hold the attention of the public." It is with great pleasure that I look forward to his lectures and the story they weave about transaction society. In today's lecture, he will examine the turn against institutions. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., he will participate in a discussion on that subject, and you are all invited to attend that right in this next door. I think we're doing this at 10 a.m. Then the second Tanner lecture will be held at this time tomorrow, when Nicholas Lemon will discuss what transactions can't do. And on Friday morning, we'll follow with another discussion section right in this building. I encourage you to attend as many of these as you can. And now, please join me in giving a warm Stanford welcome to Nicholas Lemon.
Thanks very much, John. And I want to say, in addition to well, you mentioned it very much in passing, but I was out here quite a bit over the last couple of years to set up our partnership, the Brown Institute for Media Innovation. The director of the West Coast version, Bernd Giraud, is here today. And everything about Stanford is impressive, but I was particularly impressed while we were working on this by John Hennessy sending me at 7 a.m. Pacific time on a Sunday morning the gift agreement personally rewritten by him. He's, I know, a very hands-on president. I was grateful to you for making this happen, which has been a huge event in the life of Columbia Journalism School. I hope a huge event for journalism, and would not have happened without you. It was impressive, so thanks. First, I want to thank all of you for the invitation to give these lectures. It's an honor to be a Tanner lecturer, especially for a journalist, since not many people from my profession have been Tanner lecturers. And as I suppose is often the case for Tanner lecturers, the invitation, once accepted, becomes an assignment, and therefore a much-needed prod to work up what had previously been compelling but inchoate thoughts rattling around in one's head into a more coherent form. I've been grateful to have an external form of discipline to make me do that. I can't remember the exact date or purpose, but I do remember very well that a visit to Stanford made all the difference with my last published book, Redemption, which, as John said, is an account of the end of the Reconstruction period in American history. I came to Palo Alto and presented the idea for the book to a murderer's row of professors from a variety of disciplines, including former President Gerhard Casper, who's here this evening, who, as some of you know, is a legal scholar of Reconstruction, among other things. The combination of encouragement, useful criticism, suggestions for further inquiry, and frankly, the sense that having spoken at Stanford represented a spring off the diving board and so committed me to finishing the book was a godsend. I hope that a few years from now I'll be able to return and say the same thing about the connection between these lectures and my next book. In the fall of 2012, assigned by The New Yorker to profile Mitt Romney, the Republican nominee for president, I came up with a formulation that may be a little glib, but that I believe captures something important about American society in the last half of the 20th century. I wrote that if Mitt Romney's father, George Romney, who was chairman of American Motors and then governor of Michigan, represented the mid-20th century type that William H. White in 1956 memorably named the organization man, then Mitt Romney represented a successor type, which I called transaction man. This was the title The New Yorker used for the profile. What I meant was that in the national culture, what was considered the ideal use of top talent, especially but not only in business, shifted from managing a large organization to entering high-stakes situations as an analyst, an advisor, or an investor of capital. And Mitt Romney, as head of Bain Capital, the private equity branch of a management consulting firm, performed all of these functions, and engineering a consequential transaction before moving on to the next situation. I'm sure everybody here can immediately think of examples of this shift within the circle of one's personal acquaintance. In the aggregate, I'll argue, the shift entails our having changed, not entirely consciously, our way of thinking about how to solve social, political, and economic problems. The organization to transaction shift has shaped and been shaped by significant changes in the balance of power within American society, especially toward freely moving investment capital and those who manage and direct it, and away from the congerie of large established organizations that seem to most observers in the middle of the 20th century to dominate the American landscape and those who manage and direct them. I'll offer some ideas about why, how, and when this shift occurred. I don't think it was inevitable because history is contingent, not teleological. Those will be mostly in the first lecture. And I'll also offer some thoughts, mainly in the second lecture, about the present-day effects of this shift and how we ought to think about them. In particular, I'd like to present for discussion and argument at least, the idea that the shift from an institutional to a transactional perspective may be significantly responsible for the substantial rise in economic and social inequality that has been one of the main changes in American society over the last generation. As the economists Frank Levy and Peter Temin put it in a 2007 paper, the severing of the historic connection between productivity increases in the American economy generally and broadly shared prosperity can be explained partly by the collapse of the institutions of the post-war years. A society dedicated to disassembling, disaggregating, and disintermediating existing structures and arrangements, and to relentlessly solving for economic efficiency, tends to enhance inequality. A society dedicated to maintaining and negotiating among and within institutional structures tends to decrease it. It's probably stating the obvious to say that in two short lectures about a very large subject that I'm just beginning to explore, I am necessarily going to be less than comprehensive overall and less than thorough on each specific point. I'm immensely grateful for the interactive nature of this lecture program and in advance for the comments and suggestions I'll get. I'm sure I'll go home at the end of the week with this project in better shape than it was when I arrived. Let me begin at the exact midpoint of the 20th century with two ambitious books by prominent liberal academics, each of which aimed in its own way to create a broad canvas portrait of the state of the country. These are The Lonely Crowd by David Reesman, published in 1950, and The Governmental Process by David Truman, published in 1951. Reesman's interest was mainly psychological, and Truman's mainly political, but they still make for a useful matched pair because their views were so substantially different in ways that pertain to my topic. Now, I would guess that everybody here has heard of Reisman's book. Maybe a little over-optimistic, but a few of you have. But not everyone has heard of Truman's, which may be a little too pessimistic, but may have something to it. Truman was a political scientist at Columbia University, later provost there, still later president of Mount Holyoke College. The governmental process was produced during the high water mark of the period of the pluralist theory of American politics. That is, the idea that the way to understand our democracy is as an ongoing, ever-changing, contentious, but essentially benign interaction of interest groups. Pluralism was normative as well as descriptive. The idea was that this never-ending bargaining process among groups, as long as it was conducted fairly, made for a better society than one organized around someone's idea of what would be best for everyone. American academic pluralism's sacred text was Arthur Bentley's peculiar and brilliant 1908 classic, The Process of Government, written from a remote Indiana farmhouse, which Bentley called an attempt to fashion a tool for understanding politics. Truman's book, beginning with the title, was a conscious homage to Bentley and an attempt to use the tool that Bentley had fashioned to understand and to improve the American political system as it was then. It would not be at all fair to present Truman as a Dr. Pangloss who had come to tell us that all was right with the American system. It's important to keep in mind that the mid-century moment was a profoundly scary one, with the memories of the horrors of the Depression and the Second World War still fresh, and the Korean War and the Cold War in full swing. Truman was, however, a believer in the American constitutional system, in its principal author, James Madison, and especially in the pluralist version of a founding document, Madison's Federalist No. 10. He believed that it was useless for anyone seeking to understand the workings of a society to study the individual, because, as he put it, and you'll have to excuse the 1950s era gender reference, men, wherever they are observed, are creatures participating in those established patterns of interaction we call groups. Indeed, he wrote, we do not in fact find individuals otherwise than in groups. No one belongs to only one group, and groups vary greatly in their size and degree of organization and activity. But it's nearly inevitable that as a group becomes significant, it will enter politics to seek changes in government. Pluralists were not into honoring civil society as a realm separate from and superior to politics, as many people do now. There is no one discernible national interest or public interest, except as a comforting illusion, and there is no way to achieve the long-standing, even back then, dream of good government reformers of extirpating lobbyists from politics and government. The only way to understand our society and politics is by looking at groups interacting in complex, shifting, often rough-edged ways. Even a large bureaucratic institution like a government agency or a corporation can only be understood as a group or a collection of groups constantly struggling for advantage with other groups in society. For David Reisman, by contrast, the unit of analysis was not the group but the individual. And although he presented himself as being merely a dispassionate reporter of findings, it's hard to miss his disappointment, even alarm, at what he has found, that the character of the American middle class had recently shifted from being inner-directed to other-directed. Inner-directedness corresponds roughly to Max Weber's notion of the Protestant ethic. People are instilled by their parents and their culture with a deep set of motivations and values that are internalized strongly enough to power them through life. Other-directedness is an orientation toward pleasing peers, toward being like other people, although that is an ultimately unfulfilling and empty pursuit, which is why Reisman chose the title, The Lonely Crowd. Inner-directed people are focused on production, other-directed people on consumption. For the other-directed, Reisman asserts, the currency into which all values tend to be translated is no longer money, but appraisal by the peer group. They cannot escape the insatiable force of this psychological need for approval. The shift of the American character from inner-directed to other-directed went along with, and may have been the result of, the rise of a permanent-seeming structure of large institutions that had come to dominate American life. A shopkeeper could be inner-directed, but an employee of General Electric had to be outer-directed. I read Reisman and his followers as being explicitly hostile to institutions on the grounds of their corrosive effects on the individual character. To David Truman, who considered individuals to be of no interest to those trying to understand the workings of society, it was axiomatic and obvious that, to quote him, most individuals in any cultural setting find it intolerably painful not to be accepted by the groups in which they move or hope to move. A measure of conformity is the price of acceptance. But to Reisman, groups are essentially malign, and conformity is an existentially threatening national sickness. Is it conceivable, he asked plaintively toward the end of The Lonely Crowd, that these economically privileged Americans will someday wake up to the fact that they overconform? He didn't seem to be optimistic that the answer might be yes. Reisman's discussion of American politics in The Lonely Crowd focused on the idea that with the rise of the other-directed type, with its overwhelming orientation to pleasing peers rather than to considering questions of morality, government has become dominated by what he called veto groups. To Truman, of course, veto groups are not, as he sarcastically put it, a typhoid bacillus that must be eradicated if society is to develop and prosper. They are the political system. I'm going to spend a great deal of time in these lectures discussing large publicly held business corporations, though more as social and political institutions than economic ones. So it's worth our pausing for a moment to note that for American public intellectuals in 1950, the modern corporation was a highly noteworthy, even strange-seeming institution that had rather suddenly become dominant in the tableau of American life. Big business had appeared on the American scene many years earlier during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but people understood it in terms of tycoons like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie and of the trusts they had created. What seemed new in 1950 was that these businesses had taken on a permanent bureaucratic character. Millions of Americans would now be spending their entire careers working at a single corporation, some wearing a white collar, others wearing a blue collar. Salaried professional managers who had risen through the ranks, rather than entrepreneurs, inventors, tycoons, or robber barons, would run them. Taken together, these corporations now dominated the American economy. All of this seemed to amount to a fundamentally new scheme of organization for American society, quite different from the agrarian craft or local business schemes that had preceded it. For David Truman, the corporation had grown to the point that, even though it might act as an interest group in Washington, it was itself a small society with a multiplicity of interacting groups, including managers, stockholders, and workers. Each of these would develop its own organizational structure so that, instead of managers dealing with their workers directly, executives would negotiate more formally with labor union leaders. To Truman, a pro-labor liberal, this was by no means an ominous development. The publication of his book coincided almost exactly what Daniel Bell, who was then a 30-year-old writer for Fortune magazine, dubbed the Treaty of Detroit. This was the May 1950 long-term contract negotiated by Charles Wilson of General Motors and Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers on behalf of their organizations. Today, it's almost unbearably ironic that the treaty was received as the harbinger of a wondrous new American social compact, since both GM and Detroit have recently gone bankrupt, and both the corporation and the union are far smaller today than they were then. But that is how it was received in 1950. Not very much earlier, the UAW and the automakers had been literally at war with clubs and guns. Now, GM had bought itself 5 years of labor peace, and the auto workers had gotten guaranteed annual cost of living increases, pensions, and medical coverage. As the historian Nelson Lichtenstein puts it, the treaty offered a section of the working class, largely white, male, and unionized, economic security and social benefits that would double their real incomes within a generation. If you were a pluralist like Truman, here was proof that pluralism could produce a good society. And if sitting here in Palo Alto in 2014, you're inclined to think of the Treaty of Detroit as representing everything wrong with the late 20th century American economy, please hold the thought and I'll address it tomorrow night. As for David Reisman, he, like many liberal, even radical intellectuals of the time, simply wasn't very concerned with the economic security and well-being of the average American. That was partly because the country was in such vastly better shape than it had been during the Depression that material need no longer seemed pressing. And of course, inequality in those days was decreasing rapidly, or substantially, let's say. Partly because of his all-consuming preoccupation with the menace of conformity, and partly because the American corporation seemed to be an unstoppable, eternally growing powerhouse, immune from meaningful competition and certain to continue spreading prosperity across the land. In an other-directed, consumption-obsessed society, corporations had it within their power simply to make more products and then to persuade people that they needed them in order to keep up with the Joneses. Inside the corporation, this was a time when executive compensation was much lower and federal tax rates, in fact all tax rates, were much higher than they are today. So Reisman found it safe to assume that successful management was all about building up one's personal status and encouraging other direction among one's employees, not about making the money either for the corporation or for oneself. All in all, he declared, rather than production, people, therefore, become the central problem of industry. Now, if you imagine Truman and Reisman as intellectual contestants, it's clear that Reisman won. Within academic political science, pluralism reigned for at least the decade between the publication of The Governmental Process in 1951 and the publication of Robert Dahl's Who Governs in 1961. But these works did not reach a wide public, and the 1960s brought influential academic attacks on pluralism, which I'll discuss in tomorrow evening's lecture. The Lonely Crowd, on the other hand, was never deeply respected by academic sociologists. It makes no real effort to document the shift from inner-directed to other-directed with methodological rigor. But it struck a chord. Reisman in the book appeared on the cover of Time, back when that was a supremely high accolade. Although it is in no way breezy or accessible, The Lonely Crowd was a bestseller. And Reisman's basic framing device, conformity as the leading national menace, institutions as its bearer, individualism as the remedy, became one of the reigning liberal ideas of the 1950s, and in many ways, far beyond. Intellectual and cultural works elaborating on the theme of conformity as a national menace and identifying institutions, especially corporations, as its main bearer, flowed in a great torrent. Think of novels like Richard Yates's Revolutionary Road and Sloan Wilson's The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, or movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, if you understand it as a parable about conformity, and Imitation of Life, or psychological experiments meant to demonstrate the horrors of conformity, like the ones Stanley Milgram described in his book, Obedience to Authority, or the mock prison experiments that Philip Zimbardo conducted here at Stanford. By the way, these psychological experiments make for a nice set of bookends with the Hawthorne experiments that were conducted by the industrial psychologist Eldon Mayo and his associates at a Chicago factory in the 1940s, when institutions were still esteemed and the idea that the individual was in peril had not yet caught on. They sought to demonstrate that a feeling of group membership made people more productive. In this body of work, the burgeoning American suburbs were also frequently identified as a seedbed of conformity, and of course they were presumably where corporate bureaucrats lived. I'll go into a little detail about just a few of these works as a way of bringing to the surface the argument they were making. White Collar, by the Columbia sociologist C. Wright Mills, was published at the same time as The Lonely Crowd and The Governmental Process. Though Mills was proudly radical rather than liberal, White Collar's vision matches The Lonely Crowd's almost exactly. Mills was more openly nostalgic than Reisman for a bygone America dominated by small-scale, independent, owner-operated businesses, and more melodramatically dismissive of the corporate system that he saw as having replaced it. To quote him, the decline of the free entrepreneur and the rise of the dependent employee on the American scene has paralleled the decline of the independent individual and the rise of the littler man in the American mind. Although this shift has been an economic one, the problems that concern us, Mills asserted, border on the psychiatric. Like Reisman, Mills was not very focused on the economic condition of the ordinary American, which he too treated as a solved problem. And like Reisman, he was scornful of pressure groups that negotiate better economic conditions for their members. The real problem, in his view, was that the United States had become a nation of cheerful robots. That's a quote from him, of course. I can't resist quoting just one more passage to give you more of the flavor. This is about white-collar employees of corporations. You are the cog and the belt line of the bureaucratic machinery itself. You are a link in the chains of commands, persuasions, notices, bills, which bind together the men who make decisions and the men who make things. Without you, the managerial demiurge could not be. But your authority is confined strictly within a prescribed orbit of occupational actions, and such power as you wield is a borrowed thing. Yours is the subordinate's mark. Yours is the canned talk. The money you handle is someone else's money. The papers you sort and shuffle already bear somebody else's marks. You are the servant of decision, the assistant of authority, the minion of management. Now, a few years later came William White's The Organization Man of 1956, which I mentioned earlier, and John Kenneth Galbraith's The Affluent Society, 1958. White's book is an expansion of a Fortune magazine article on life in the Chicago suburb of Park Forest, built out into another lament about the state of the American character. His title characters, he tells us, are the ones of our middle class who have left home, spiritually as well as physically, to take the vows of organizational life, and it is they who are the mind and soul of our great self-perpetuating institutions. They have replaced Weber's Protestant ethic with what White calls the social ethic, which is, quote, that contemporary body of thought which makes morally legitimate the pressures of society against the individual. Speaking of canonical German sociologists, most of the 1950s books that sounded alarms about the rise of conformity in the United States are really about what Ferdinand Tönnies idea of the shift from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft, from a traditional society to a modern one. They regard this shift, which necessarily entails more emphasis on the role of large institutions and on formal rules and procedures, as being almost entirely unfortunate. Galbraith's book, another unlikely bestseller, was a narrower attack on the conventional wisdom, which is a term Galbraith coined in the pages of The Affluent Society, of his profession, economics, especially its idea that ever-increasing production should be the dominant goal of government policymakers. Both White and Galbraith partook fully of the view of the large business corporation as all-powerful. The leading corporations show marked indications of immortality, Galbraith declared. This was because in a consumption-obsessed society, corporations had the power, through advertising in the mass media, to generate a demand at will, simply by persuading the gullible public that it needed more consumer goods. Galbraith was less concerned with the problem of individual conformity than White and the others, and more concerned with creating a more active and well-financed public sector, but both of them were in effect proposing that liberalism cease to be chiefly concerned with the well-being of ordinary Americans. It was time to move on to psychological or characterological problems that were more pressing. As Galbraith put it, in fact, the major uncertainties of economic life, subject to some caution concerning the control of depressions, have already been eliminated. The ones that remain are of much reduced urgency. Now, I want to pivot in a moment to another set of perspectives on the corporation from within business. But before I do, it's worth noting that I could devote far more time than I have to surveying the line of descent from David Reesman, and indeed I'm showing incredible self-restraint not to spend all 2 lectures reviewing books attacking conformity in the 50s and 60s. Of many works in the line, one that holds up very well to my mind is Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963. We think of it properly as a pioneering work of feminism, but if you reread it, you'll see that its context is the by now familiar world of consumer society, conformity, suburbia, and the stifling of individuality. One of the works that doesn't hold up so well, except as a document of its cultural moment, is Charles Reich's The Greening of America from 1970, whose terminology for its own neo-Tonesian distinction is consciousness 1 and consciousness 2. Reich took the argument that had been building over 2 decades to its logical endpoint by asserting that our society, quote, can be thought of as a single vast corporation with every person as an involuntary member and employee. As that brief quote indicates, Reich was yet another anti-institutionalist. One of the central aspects of consciousness, too, he noted witheringly, is an acceptance of the priority of institutions, organizations, and society, and a belief that the individual must tie his destiny to something of this sort, larger than himself, and subordinate his will to it. He is an institution man. He sees his own life and career in terms of progress within society and within an institution. He also looks to institutions to provide personal security in terms of tenure, salary, and retirement benefits, things we could all dispense of from then on, presumably. Now, it's my sense that one crucial part of the anti-conformity liberal intellectual's catechism has lost its salience by now. Today, we seem to be far more concerned about the erosion of community than we are about the extinguishing of individualism. But in other ways, their legacy is still with us. To their credit, they helped create cultural space for the emergence of what David Truman called unorganized groups, like the feminists inspired by Friedan and others, whose concerns had been excluded from American institutional life, and to organize themselves and achieve widespread and lasting change. And more broadly, words like corporate and bureaucratic still carry a distinct stench. at least a substantial region of liberalism lost its fluency in the language of economic argument for quite a while because it became so accustomed to assuming that economic concerns had become secondary and cultural ones primary. The pluralists' idea of liberalism's operating through groups, organizations, and institutions that build up enough strength to be able to make effective, self-interested claims in bargaining sessions with other groups fell deeply out of fashion. The succeeding ideal was of a liberalism based on the eloquent assertion of one or another powerful moral claim, which would succeed through the force of its argument rather than through its power and skill at lobbying and organizing. In the years following the end of the Second World War, it was an open and hotly contested question how far the United States would go in the direction of setting up a social democratic or corporatist social order that would go further in the direction of a state role in economic, social, and social life than the New Deal had. And the answer to that question turned out to be not very far. Now, in the 1950s, many liberals wound up implicitly accepting an idea that they'd spent the late 1940s grumbling about, that corporations, rather than government, would become significant guarantors of health care, job security, and retirement benefits, at least for the middle class. If you were a lifer at IBM or DuPont, you had other problems, not those. Private institutions were a substantial bearer of responsibility for the social welfare of a significant portion of the country. I'm engaging in this exercise in intellectual history because I believe it mattered. Ideas do not usually have a scientifically provable causal relationship with events, but history as it unfolds has an idea content as one of its elements, and the ideas come from somewhere. You can hear, for example, language from some of the books I've been discussing in John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign and his administration, especially The Affluent Society, which shouldn't be surprising because Galbraith worked for Kennedy. Kennedy's rhetoric implicitly contrasted Dwight Eisenhower, an organization man if ever there was one, with himself as a younger, more vigorous and unbureaucratic kind of leader. As president, Kennedy repeatedly chose to work around rather than through existing government bureaucracies. And in less visible but nonetheless highly consequential ways, anti-institutionalism made itself felt in the way legislation and regulations were written, the way court decisions were framed, the way leaders were trained to think about society and the course of their own lives. I will give some examples tomorrow. Right now, I want to return to intellectual history, pursuing its course on the issues I've been discussing from inside the business world rather than outside of it. One can take an economic determinist view of the corporation, which would be that its shape and form and practices can be understood simply as rational responses to market forces. But there's also a tradition of business people and students of business understanding the corporation more as a social institution. It's important to bear in mind how rapidly large-scale industrial capitalism spread across the American landscape. Big business essentially didn't exist before the Civil War, with the possible exception of the early railroad enterprises. And by the way, 2/3 of the listed companies on the New York Stock Exchange in 1900 were railroad companies. And before, say, 1925, the corporation was associated mainly with its founding empire-building owner-operators. Then, quickly, publicly held corporations run by career executives, employing in some cases hundreds of thousands of people, came to dominate the American economy, and this situation appeared to be permanent. As Charles and Mary Beard wrote in 1930, in the place of innumerable isolated plants owned by natural persons engaged in competitive production to meet local needs, was exhibited a network of corporations controlling enormous establishments from which issued 3/4 of the annual output of manufactures, indicating that the anarchy of competition was held in check by combinations, conversations, and understandings competent for most eventualities. American society devoted a good measure of its energies during the first half of the 20th century to creating an infrastructure of large institutions. There's no better example than Stanford University in the first half of the 20th century. In fact, the leading corporations were the largest of them, except for the military during wartime. They were far larger than the bureaucracies of the federal government. To operate a coherent, ongoing organization on this scale was like creating a whole society. The young Peter Drucker was given scholarly access to the internal workings of General Motors for 18 months during the Second World War. In the book he wrote as a result, Concept of the Corporation, published in 1946, he announced that the large American corporation had become our representative social institution. Continuing to quote him, "It sets the pattern and determines the behavior even of the owner of the corner cigar store who never owned a share of stock, and of his errand boy who never set foot in a mill." End of quote. But I'm going to start quoting again. "Big government and big labor," according to Drucker, quote, "are nothing but social responses to the phenomenon of modern big business and of the corporation. All in all," quoting again, "the emergence of big business, i.e. the large integrated industrial unit, as a social reality during the past 50 years is the most important event in the recent social history of the Western world." Drucker's main concern was with describing how GM had created a divisional structure as a way of managing its vastness, a story that was recounted in more detail later in Alfred Sloan's memoir with organization charts, My Years with General Motors, which for many years business school students had to read as summer reading before they entered, but I think those days have ended, and in the work of the business historian Alfred D. Chandler. But that bespeaks his overriding concern with the corporation as an institution rather than as an economic entity. He mentioned money only rarely. At one point, he asserted that the methods of GM's division managers are essentially the same as the reported approach of Soviet industrial managers. He referred dismissively to the idea that a corporation can be understood as existing to serve the interests of its shareholders as an old, crude fiction. Maintaining cohesive purpose among the people who work there was far more the essential task. The corporation's social function as a community, Drucker said, is as important as its economic function as an efficient producer. This social understanding of the corporation, to Drucker, had implications that went far beyond the boundaries of each individual business entity. Quoting him instead, again, "The survival of the very meaning of our society depends on the ability of the large corporation to give substantial realization of the American creed in an industrial society." The dissimilarities between Drucker's view and that of the liberal thinkers about corporations whose views I was discussing a few minutes ago should be obvious, but it's also worth noting the similarities. Both presented the corporation as a rather startling and hugely significant new form of social organization, and both saw the corporation's life as being principally about organizing human activity rather than about the struggle to survive and prosper in the marketplace. People in business, naturally, saw the social aspects of the corporation as noble rather than malign, as Reisman and his followers did. To them, successful management was an art, a science, a benign and creative social activity. One of the pioneer versions of the now ubiquitous American type, the management expert, was Chester Barnard, a career executive at AT&T who rose to the rank of president of the New Jersey Bell Telephone Company. In his 1938 book, The Functions of the Executive, Barnard put at the top of the list of skills a manager needs the inculcation of belief in the real existence of a common purpose by those who work in a corporation. That was because the corporation is, quote, dependent upon the willingness of individuals to cooperate and to contribute their efforts to the cooperative system. In his litany of tools that are at a manager's disposal in his effort to generate this cooperation, Barnard placed very little emphasis on economic ones. Quoting him again, the unaided power of material incentives when the minimum incentives are satisfied, in my opinion, is exceedingly limited as to most men. It is much more important for the executive to have and to demonstrate to his employees that he has what Barnard called personal moral codes. Now, if you're a hard-headed person who demands a more structural and less mystical explanation of how the corporation could have been so socially oriented, so blithely unconcerned with the analyst calls and quarterly earnings reports and stock prices that, we're told, are all chief executives can think about today, the best place to go is Adolph Burley and Gardner Means's landmark 1933 book, The Modern Corporation and Private Property. Burley and Means's big idea was that the American corporation was distinctive not only in its size and the rapidity of its rise to the leading role in the economy, which they marveled over like all these other thinkers I've been quoting from, but also in its having severed the historic link in business enterprises between ownership and control. The 200 largest corporations, they asserted, controlled about half of the national wealth, and most of them were public companies owned by a large, widely dispersed, passive cohort of stockholders, the fabled mom-and-pop investors. That meant the people who controlled the corporations, their top management, were only insignificantly its owners. And conversely, the owners were able to exercise only insignificant influence on the corporation. Quote, the translation of perhaps 2/3 of the industrial wealth of the country from individual ownership to ownership by large, publicly financed corporations vitally changes the lives of property owners, the lives of workers, and the methods of property tenure, Burley and Means wrote. The divorce of ownership from control, consequent on that process, almost necessarily involves a new form of economic organization of society. And elsewhere, the dissolution of the atom of property destroys a very foundation of the economic order on which the economic order of the past 3 centuries has rested. The Modern Corporation and Private Property was published exactly coincident with the onset of the New Deal, which Burley and Means strongly supported. Burley was a leading member of Franklin Roosevelt's Brains Trust. What was most interesting to them about the new separation of ownership and control in business was that it created opportunities for government. The power of American corporations was now, quote, comparable to the concentration of religious power in the medieval church or of political power in the national state. It was therefore only natural that corporations be made to accept responsibility for the well-being of those who are subject to the organization, whether workers, investors, or consumers. And, as Burley and Means hinted from time to time, the modern corporation's executives might even be amenable to this sort of outside intrusion because they had so little incentive, as at best minor shareholders, to resist fiercely any incursion on the potential profitability of the corporation. Why shouldn't they be statesmanlike with respect to the interests of workers and consumers, so long as it didn't threaten their ability to remain in control of the great enterprise? Besides this rather powerful reason, the mid-century corporation had others to be relatively impervious to the vagaries of economic life. Almost no contemporary commentator mentioned it, but it's obvious now that the United States, during and after the Second World War, occupied an extraordinarily advantageous, if temporary, position in the global economy, because the other major developed nations were far more damaged by the war than we had been, and so were less able to set the terms of political economy. The corporation was still relatively young, still growing, and still relatively immune even to domestic competition. Information technology and communication were in the hands of the corporate few, not the individual many. Culturally, as almost all the authors I've quoted acknowledged, the country simply was not very money-oriented, once severe material want had been taken care of. Writers in the 1950s could not see into the future, but the point is especially dramatic if you're able to compare national attitudes toward money then and now as we are. And American culture was also conditioned to be almost reverential, again, especially by our standards today, toward large established institutions and their leaders in and out of business. It was institutions, after all, that had defeated the Depression and the Axis, and made the United States the preeminent world power, and now they were essential to the next national challenge, winning the Cold War. Understood as a vast, invulnerable, and essentially social rather than economic institution, the corporation could bear a heavy load in a system that the business historian Stanford Jacoby calls welfare capitalism. Its executives aspired to be statesmanlike and to keep many inside and outside constituencies happy. Its workers were prospering. Its shareholders were quiescent. Liberals of the traditional kind could keep trying to increase the social tax on corporations as a way of bringing the United States closer to the social democratic ideal that had emerged in Western Europe. Liberals of the newer kind, represented by David Reisman and others I've mentioned here, could focus on creating and expanding a new cultural space outside the grip of the corporations and other large institutions. For a long time, nobody could imagine that the throne on which GM and GE and AT&T and the others sat was anything but rock solid. A useful place to find in concentrated form the baseline ideas from which the country has dramatically departed since those days is a collection of essays published in 1959 called The Corporation in Modern Society, edited and introduced by the Dean of Harvard School of Public Policy, Edward S. Mason. Not all of the contributors, a roster of eminent establishmentarians of the day, including Kingman Brewster, Eugene Rostow, Richard Crossland, and Carl Kaysen, agreed on all points, but nobody disputed that big corporations had become the dominant American institutions, all-powerful, immune to economic pressure, and able to shoulder an astonishing array of social missions. As Mason put it, I'll quote this, which is perhaps the most ironic in Palo Alto of all the quotes I've given. Innovation at the hands of the small-scale inventor and individual entrepreneur has given way to organized research. The role of government in the economy persistently increases. The rugged individualist has been supplanted by smoothly efficient corporate executives participating in the group decision. The equity owner is joining the bondholder as a functionless rentier. Obviously, all that changed. Any change of such magnitude has multiple complicated sources. I want to conclude this lecture by focusing on just one intellectual event, the publication in 1976 in an obscure new economics journal of Michael Jensen and William Meckling's article called Theory of the Firm, Managerial Behavior, Agency Costs, and Ownership Structure, which, as I am writing this, or as I was writing this, as I'm saying this, has accumulated an astonishing 40,000 academic citations. Jensen and Meckling were economists who lived deep inside their own profession's debate about the nature of the firm and who at the time were not much interested in the larger social and political questions about corporations that I've been discussing. They were writing in opposition to the idea, which they primarily associated with Milton Friedman, that a corporation can be usefully understood as a completely rational, eternally profit-maximizing entity. Jensen told me recently that the first time he presented the paper at Friedman's department at the University of Chicago, he was mocked, and that it was turned down by the leading economics journals where he had submitted it. That was why it was published in the Journal of Financial Economics, which Jensen himself had founded only 2 years earlier. Theory of the firm belongs in a tradition of work by economists, including John R. Commons, Ronald Coase, Oliver Williamson, and also arguably Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, that in one way or another introduces new complicating elements to the classic economic rational understanding of how individuals and firms behave. Jensen and Meckling's particular realm was principal-agent theory, which wrestles with the problem of how to present someone, the agent, who is hired to carry out a task by an economic actor, the principal, from screwing it up. Their famous paper was, as they say at the outset, a return to the theme of the separation of corporate ownership and control that Burley and Means had introduced a generation earlier. For Jensen and Meckling, in a corporation, the principal is the shareholders. The agent is the management, and the problem is that the latter can't be relied upon to represent the interests of the former. To quote them, as the owner-manager's fraction of the equity falls, his fractional claim on the outcomes falls, and this will tend to encourage him to appropriate larger amounts of the corporate resources in the form of perquisites, they note ominously, and they go through a list of these. This is a paper that you all should read. It has many formulas in it, but there's also this passage where they attack corporate executives for hiring beautiful secretaries as an example of their not being economically motivated enough, as you can see in Mad Men. As the manager's ownership claim falls, his incentive to devote significant effort to creative activities such as searching out new profitable ventures falls. He may in fact avoid such ventures simply because it requires too much trouble or effort on his part to manage or learn about new technologies. Where Burley and Means saw in the autonomy of corporate management an opportunity for society to demand more from the corporation, Jensen and Meckling saw shareholders being ripped off by self-protective corporate bureaucrats. To them, it was axiomatic that corporations should be run for the benefit of their owners, not for the benefit of society, and certainly not for the benefit of management. Their solution to the problem was to give shareholders more control and to give management incentives to care more deeply about the value of the firm. These might include tying executive pay to performance through stock options, these are totally new ideas at the time, and other means, and taking on more corporate debt because that would create pressure to operate the firm more profitably. Just as one can use the publication of The Lonely Crowd as signaling the beginning of a distinct moment in American intellectual history without over-attributing to that single piece of writing the power to change the course of history, so too one can say that Theory of the Firm makes a good marker for the beginning of an era without implying that it caused the era to begin. The heyday of the organization man had come to a close, not as a result of a quarter century of ever more fierce attacks from a liberal, culturally oriented perspective, but because the financial markets, at a time of economic stagnation and increasing competition from abroad, were losing patience with him. The corporation, to use Daniel Bell's terminology, was about to change from a sociologizing to an economizing institution whose aim was performance rather than size. The heyday of Transaction Man, to whom I will refer henceforth as Transaction Person, since we're not in the 1950s anymore, was beginning. I should just say as an aside, Jensen himself, Meckling has passed away. Jensen's still with us. He, like many prophets, believes that many things done attributed to his paper were based on misunderstandings of his ideas, and he's very bitter about it. And his now chief activity is partnering with Werner Erhard, the founder of EST, and they travel around the country doing roadshows about leadership together. So that's a whole other story for another day. Most of the writing about corporations that I have been quoting from refers to the financial markets not at all. The prevailing idea of the organization man era was that financiers like J.P. Morgan had been important in assembling large business entities in the first place, but that by the mid-20th century, Wall Street had become merely a well-heeled service provider to the mighty corporation. Mark Mizrucci, in The Fracturing of the American Corporate Elite, a very good new recently published book, writes, "The banks were seen as playing a primarily advisory role, similar to lawyers and accountants, at most a site of mediation rather than a source of power." Adolf Berle kind of reemerged in the 1950s to declare that the corporation had now become so large and so profitable that it could generate all the capital it needed internally from retained earnings and could essentially write off Wall Street. The capital is there, and so is capitalism, he wrote, there being the corporation. The waning figure is the capitalist. So in other words, he believed that the United States had invented capitalism without capitalists. It was the idea of the corporate manager as a kind of omnicompetent Superman, and of the corporation as a limitless generator through its profits of capital to finance expansion, that led to the short-lived conglomerate trend of the 1960s, in which many leading corporations became collections of a wide range of tangentially related companies. Now the balance of power began to shift. An increasingly deregulated and empowered financial industry got the whip hand over big business and began taking apart and reassembling the corporation through mergers, leveraged buyouts, and in other investment vehicles, increasingly on a global rather than national scale. Working in these financial entities replaced being a corporate lifer as the paradigmatic form of elite employment in the United States. One of the contributors to Edward Mason's collection that I mentioned a minute ago noted that the three universities most heavily represented among the executives of big non-financial corporations were Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, which is inconceivable today because business-inclined students at those schools, not to mention Stanford, are so much more powerfully drawn to finance, consulting, and entrepreneurship. I'll go into the details of how all that happened in tomorrow's lecture. In 1993, Michael Jensen gave a speech warning that the United States was undergoing a new industrial revolution that was likely to have profound and disruptive social effects. Although the vast increases in productivity associated with the 19th century industrial revolution increased aggregate welfare, he said, the large costs associated with the obsolescence of human and physical capital generated substantial hardship, misunderstanding, and bitterness. So it would be with the financial revolution of the late 20th century. Jensen was hardly opposed to it, but he thought the country hadn't paid enough attention to the need to ameliorate its harsher effects. The corporation had become, in effect, a significant provider of welfare state benefits to a significant portion of the country. Shareholders had borne the cost of that, but now, newly empowered, their patience had run out. Meanwhile, the country had become unaccustomed to sorting out people's claims to welfare and health in the traditional way, through political organizing and institutional bargaining in Washington and the state capitals, because it had seemed that corporations could do that work, and liberalism could expend its energies on other, seemingly morally grander and less mundane projects. That left a major national mission undone. Much of the bewildering condition of our politics today can be understood as an unplanned and often unlovely reaction to the financial revolution and to our impatience with looking for institutional solutions to our problems. And I will leave you hanging on that cliff. See you tomorrow evening. Thank you.